Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar, part 2 of the key considerations when delivering apprenticeships. Quick note before I hand you over to our speakers today is Paula Gibson, Brian Kingsland, and Paul Zini. Make sure you have enough bandwidth on your internet connections. At the other end, if it's below 2 meg, you will start to lose quality of the sound. So please make sure you have all other windows closed. And if you have any questions at the end, please do put them in the questions panel, and we will aim to answer those at the very end. And what we don't answer, we will put in a Q&A. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Paula, who's going to kick off our presentation today.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is Paula Gibson. Thank you for joining us. You're all very welcome today. So as Afti said, this is the second part of our webinar series, which is around key considerations when delivering apprentices aimed at employer providers. Just to set a bit of context, these apprenticeships, these webinars were really born out of the fact that we felt employers needed some support around some very specific topics when we ran some employer events last year around how to prepare for Ofsted.
Paula, we're losing your sound, I'm afraid.
Pardon?
We're losing your sound, I'm afraid.
Okie doke. Well, in that case, I'm just going to hand straight over to yourself, Bryony, who's in the room, who can probably take you through the session, given my sound is failing.
Right, no, it's okay. You're back again now. It's typical, isn't it?
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, everybody, about that. So just to recap, today's topics, we're going to be dealing with some very specific areas that employers felt were of importance. So I'm delighted to have Paul Zini involved, who's our technical advisor for functional skills. There's been lots of reforms in that area over the last couple of months, so he's going to be talking about that. And Brian is going to be talking about the ESFA audits, which I know some employers have been wanting to hear about those as well.
Paula?
Yeah, sorry, I was just making sure that everyone could hear me. So I'm just going to. You can hear me, okay? So
yeah, sorry, everybody. Paula's having to dial in today because she's in another part of the country, so you have to excuse the slight hiccups on sound.
Okie doke. So the first slide just gives you some context around the state of UK skills, which we did cover during last week's session. So I'm going to go straight into the main body of the session today and hand over to Bryony, who's going to talk you through ESFA updates, audits.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Paula. Sorry about that, everybody. It's one of those things about having someone dial in rather than actually be here, but sometimes that's inevitable. We just can't help it. Thanks very much, Paula. Okay, so let's just go back a slide. So bit of context to this. I actually attended an event just before Christmas with one of the ESFA auditors and listened to what they had to say in respect of what's happening with the ESFA financial audits. And oh, hang on, we're having real problems today, aren't we? Why is that doing that? Okay, great. Okay, so sorry about the technical issues, everybody. It's going to be a good day today. That's what a 5 AM get up does for you. So put a bit of context on the ESFA financial audits. The next round of ESFA financial audits will take place in April and May this year. So they are coming up. So we thought this was a key time to actually give you some hints and tips and talk about some of the common issues that the ESFA auditors are coming up against, so that you can go back into your own organisation and examine what you're doing and see if any of those common issues are occurring in your organisation and address them before the auditors maybe land on your front doorstep going, ooh, we've come to look at all your learners and see if we can see if you're doing what you're meant to be doing. Because if you're not doing what they want you to do, then inevitably they will claw back funding. So these are some of the comments that were flagged by some of the auditors. This doesn't just relate to apprenticeships, because the auditors do audit both apprenticeships 16 to 19 and 19 plus. So some of these are related to other areas, but it's still worth flagging. So as you can see there on the left, a lot of the stuff coming up is prior qualifications. And then the other bit that comes up fairly regularly is the learner on an apprenticeship being enrolled on the correct level of English and maths. Now, Paul is going to speak about that later, but that particularly pertains to apprenticeships and making sure that they are on the correct level, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. one of the things that the auditor flagged is that many of the funding and data errors identified during their audit assurance visits can be prevented if you, as providers or employer providers, review your own learner data for completeness and accuracy. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, because basically the ILR, the individual learner record, is the primary data source used by auditors to reconcile your delivery against the evidence that they can see from your ILR at learner level. It's therefore really important that your ILR accurately reflects the information held on the apprenticeship file relating to the apprenticeship's duration, the actual start and end dates, learners' prior attainment and employment status, and everything else that you input to that ILR. You know, even birth dates are extremely important. And you must hold that evidence to support the funding that you've claimed. If you don't hold it, they will claw back funding from you. So that must be available to assure the auditors that the apprentice exists. And the evidence pack within the apprenticeship funding rules provides full details of what content you should be keeping as evidence. So it's worth looking at the funding rules and going to the bottom and looking at the evidence pack to make sure that you've got everything in place that's needed. So how can you help yourself in respect of ESFA funding and assurance audits and reviews? They're carried out by the team with probably the longest name on the face of the planet, the Provider Market Oversight Assurance Team. They just used to be called the Financial Assurance Team, which was so much easier. So I'm not quite sure why the PMOAT, where that one came from, but they definitely got themselves a name there. So they basically, any provider can be picked for an assurance audit, a financial assurance audit, or a funding audit is what we used to call them, and any employer provider as well that's drawing down their levy and using it to deliver apprenticeships. As part of your ILR data return on a monthly basis, there are two toolkits or two systems, two software packages that you can use as providers or employer providers that can help you check your own data. The PDSAT is a provider data self-assessment toolkit that you can download on the link there. It enables you to look at your data from the point of view of what the data is actually telling you as a provider. So the PDSAT system gives you a swathe of reports which tell you what's going on with your data. One of the reports that it gives you, for example, is a report under Funding Model 36, which is report number 19A 211. That lists the learners that have a negotiated price of 100% of the funding band, or in some, and it also flags where apprenticeship price negotiations are in terms of percentage. So it'll flag the number of apprentices that are at less than 100% of the funding band. It will flag any apprentices that are that have been negotiated over the price of the funding band, and you will have to explain that to an auditor, as well as those that have a percentage below the full funding band. The auditors use that report a lot, that 19A 211 report. It's one of the things that they first look at to see if a provider has a very high percentage of apprenticeships that are being charged at 100% of the funding band or above. That for them is a red flag and is going to result in the likelihood of you receiving a funding audit. And as it says up there, you're only given 2 to 4 weeks notice of a visit. It can take place at any point during the start of the funding year, but we do know that the next round is in April, May. The FIS, the Funding Information System, is a different type of system in terms of what it gives you. That looks at your data accuracy. So it looks at what you've input and it flags up things like incorrect birth dates, and it does things like calculate your funding and your derived variables. And it creates a range of reports based on your ILR data, but it summarises learners by funding stream, high needs, apprentices, occupancy reports, things like that. Whereas the data self-assessment gives you a suite of reports that enables you to look at what you are actually delivering and how you're delivering it, and whether you think that's going to be information that will be picked up by an auditor and they'll decide to audit you, because they don't audit everybody, they do take it in turns, but they look at the data first and they use your ILR data to make decisions about who they're going to audit. So what I thought would be a helpful point would be to actually have a look at some of the common issues that auditors have been finding in the last round of audits, because inevitably that's probably what they're going to look at in the next round of audits. So common issues that have been flagged by auditors, and there's a few there that I'm sure you would expect to see. So inevitably, prior learning, the main issue that the auditors have found has been providers claiming funding without taking prior learning, prior experience, prior knowledge and prior skills that a learner might have gained from either a previous qualification or a previous apprenticeship, or even from their work activity. That has not been taken into account, and in actual fact, learning and skills is being re-delivered to someone that already has those learning and skills. And one of the things that the ESFA make very clear in all their sets of funding rules is that as far as repeat learning goes, they will not fund it. Their intention is to never fund repeat learning unless there is a serious gain that can be proved to either the employer or the learner. In most cases, it's the learner they're looking at. So prior learning and initial assessment is a really key aspect of what the auditors look at. If you're not carrying that out effectively and you're not evidencing why you are delivering a full qualification, if there is some prior learning, or you haven't reduced the content and duration of the apprenticeship or learning program in line with the learning that the knowledge and skills that the learner already has, then they'll pick up on that and they will, if necessary, claw back funding. The other issue is evidence of learning start. So this occurs when funding is claimed for a learner who is participating, but you can't provide evidence to show that participation. Some of it can be since the beginning of an apprenticeship or learning program. Some of it can be periods in the middle of the learning program, but you have to be able to show the auditor for any of the learners that they choose to look at that your learner has been on program for the entire time. So they will expect to see participation and evidence of learning for the entire time they've been on that program, and they often pick up that there's a lack of evidence of learning at the start or for some periods, and again they'll call back funding for that. English and Maths I've already flagged. Learners who've not previously achieved a level 2 in English and Maths were not enrolled onto the correct aim, and they also find no documentary evidence of the offer of progression to study for a level 2. So in some cases what they've been finding is that providers are putting learners automatically onto a level 1 functional skills or English and Maths qualification, when realistically your learner's already got a level 1 and they should be on a level 2. Now we know that basic skills initial assessments can flag a lack of learning at level 1 or a lack of skills at level 2 for English and Maths. But if they've already taken that qualification and they've got a pass, you can't put them through it again. So, but what you can do is put them on the level 2 and help them to progress to level 2 by giving them extra support to cover those areas of level 1 where they may not actually be showing on your initial assessment as being particularly strong. Amazingly, there are a number of apprentices who were not employed when they commenced their apprenticeship program. That is a definite no-no. You can't do that one. Your apprentice has to be employed before they start. Off-the-job training is another very common issue for auditors. Insufficient or no documentary evidence to show how off-the-job was calculated, how it was planned, and how it was delivered. And often when they're doing off-the-job, no actual evidence of delivery and no actual evidence of the apprentice's time off the job. So it's really important that not only do you show the calculations of how you decided that the amount of off-the-job that's got to be delivered, but also that you encourage, that you make sure that your apprentices are actually collecting that evidence either via a logbook or via their calendar or via a digital e-platform that enables you to, such as our learning system or Get to Gateway or Pivot, that enable you to track that time off the job with the apprentice quite easily and monitor it and make sure that at the end of the apprenticeship you've delivered all the job off the job that was flagged at the beginning as needed in terms of 20% of the time. And finally, apprenticeship agreement and commitment statement. Both those documents must be in the evidence pack. You've got to have the signatures on the from the employer and the apprentice on the commitment statement. On the apprenticeship agreement, and on the commitment statement between the apprentice, the provider, and the employer provider or employer. You've got to have those two documents and they've got to be signed. If they are not there, the absence of this evidence definitely results in a funding error and can result in clawback. And as I said earlier, for off the job, if the off the job is not achieved, then the whole apprenticeship for that learner is ineligible for funding. So they won't just claw back part of it if you don't have sufficient documentary and planned off the job evidence. They will claw back the funding for the entire apprenticeship. So watch out for that one. It's really key. So as you can see, there are a lot of common issues popping up. So this is the second page of common issues. Ineligible costs are costs such as negotiated price, confirming how that was calculated, making sure that the negotiated price does not contain costs which are not paid for by the apprenticeship. So it's got to be clear that only eligible costs have been included. So in some cases, we've had auditors have had providers and employers who have agreed a qualification as part of the apprenticeship, but that qualification isn't mandatory to the apprenticeship, but it's been included in negotiated cost. If it's a non-mandatory qualification, the employer has to pay for it. If it maps to the standard, you can use the ON programme, but they will still have to pay for the registration and certification costs for that particular qualification. That's not an eligible cost, and there are various other eligible and non-eligible costs, all of them listed in the apprenticeship funding rules for 2019-2020. There's 2 clear pages of eligible and non-eligible costs that you should be clear on, and if you're worried about that, then do check it before April, May, so you know that you're up to scratch. Learner status, this occurs when the provider is claiming for continued participation on the apprenticeship programme, but it can't be confirmed from evidence of learning activity. So that one's really key. I think I sort of covered that slightly earlier on, but this is also about end dates as well. So if you look at the next section down, you can see when learners have left early or gone on a break, quite often providers are not actually withdrawing them from the apprenticeship. Now, if they've gone on a break that's longer than 6 weeks, sorry, no, I think it's longer than 4 weeks, you have to withdraw them from the programme, unless, of course, it's redundancy and you're intending to continue tending to deliver and finish that apprenticeship with them. I have already done a webinar on the breaks in learning and withdrawing apprenticeships and what happens to an apprentice that's been made redundant. That's up on our website if you want to access it, so I won't go into too much more detail about that. Employer contributions over down there to the bottom left hand side. You must have evidence that your employers that are SMEs and are not paying the levy, or who have used up all their levy and are paying the co-investment. You must have the invoiced evidence and the bank statements or back transfers that show that the 10% co-investment, actually there should be 5% co-investment now, shouldn't it? The 5% co-investment has actually been paid, or any price over the negotiated price of the funding band maximum. You've got to have that evidence, because again, if that's not there, then the auditors will claw back funding. Minimum duration, hopefully everyone's got this one now, but actually auditors are still picking up apprenticeships that are not meeting the minimum duration of 12 months. Now that's 12 months on programme. The endpoint assessment comes after the minimum duration of 365 days. So when you input your minimum duration to your ILR, you should include time after that 365 days for EPA to take place at any sort of gathering of evidence, any project that the apprentice has to put together. Take that into consideration when you're planning your minimum duration, and make sure that the on programme is for a minimum duration of 365 days, plus the time for endpoint assessment. And also finally, and this won't be going on for much longer because this is framework completions, and as we know, all frameworks are being closed on 31st of July this year, and everything moves to standards from the 1st of August, so there will be you will no longer be able to deliver apprenticeship frameworks as from the 1st of August this year. But some providers have been making claims for completion of frameworks, but they were not able to show completion certificates from their awarding body. Or the applications were held or greater than 3 months old, because if your application for completion is more than 3 months old, you have to provide all that evidence again. So if you are still running frameworks, make sure that you've claimed and you've got your completion certificates and you've got your final certificates, and that you're claiming within the 3 months of the end of the apprenticeship, otherwise that becomes defunct. So that's the areas for audit. I'm sure you've probably got some questions about that, so please do feel quite free to put questions up on the question section on your control panel on the top right hand side. And now I'm just going to have a very quick overview of the new audit areas that the auditors are wanting to look at in April, May. So they will look at wider eligibility. They'll look at negotiated price again, because that was such an issue in the last round of audits. They particularly look at negotiated price where there's been initial assessment and recognition of prior learning, because realistically, negotiated price should be reduced if there is prior learning that needs to be taken into account, along with a reduction in duration as well. They'll look at English and Maths and the eligibility to make sure that the learner's on the correct level and they are progressing. They're not repeating learning there, because again, if they've already taken a level 1, then there could be some repeat learning in there. They will inevitably look at 20% off the job, the quantity, the delivery of it, making sure that you're tracking that delivery and you're progressing, and also that it's been completed, the full amount of 20% off the job is completed before gateway. They will make sure that you've got a written agreement, a commitment statement and an apprenticeship agreement that are signed by every single apprentice that they look at, and all your employers. So make sure you've got all of those in place. They'll make sure there's been employer co-investment has been paid and you have evidence of that. They'll check payment of the price over the funding band maximum. That's where you have charged an employer more than the funding band maximum. You must have evidence in place to say why you are doing that and what it is the employer is paying for, because the ESFA want to make sure that any programme being delivered is quality and that actually what the employer is paying for is relevant and eligible. They'll look at the additional payments that are made for 16 to 18-year-olds, 19 to 24-year-olds with an education, health and care plan and care leaver bursaries. They'll want to see your evidence to make sure that the payments they're making are, and the learners that you've got those payments for are eligible, and that you have the evidence in place, i.e. a copy of the care plan or a letter from the local authority, or that you've proof of date of birth for the 16 to 18-year-old. They'll also check the small employer co-investment waiver. So they'll look at the size of your employer and make sure the number of employees they've got means the co-investment waiver is relevant. And they'll look at completion and the endpoint assessment. So those are all the new areas for audit in April, May that you need to be ready for. And you should be using the FIS and the PDSAT on those links that I gave you earlier on to download and check your own data to make sure it's accurate. And we do provide some further support on this. I run a workshop which can either be run on site or with a group of providers in a network, which is about initial assessment and prior learning and best practice in that, delivering as a whole organisational approach. And we can support you with readiness for audit as well, with either workshops or over the phone support. That's part of our consultancy service. So we can do that for you as well if you are at all concerned about your readiness for audit in April, May later on this year. And that's it for me, and I'm now going to pass on to Paul, who is going to talk to you about maths and English in apprenticeships and the recent changes to functional skills.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Sorry, take a sip of water at that point. Thanks very much, Bryony. What I was going to do was sort of lead on a little bit from what we were before, and I'll certainly touch on the actual changes to functional skills and kind of some of the implications of those. But I thought it was useful, obviously, to again provide a little bit of context to all of this, and again put a little bit of context behind some of the expectations that you see in some of the rules. This is quote listed directly from the ESFA funding rules. It kind of shows the intent from government that developing maths and English is an integral part of all apprenticeship programs. I think we always see, and it's sometimes it can grate a little bit, but a lot of the rhetoric is always framed around qualification achievement, and of course that matters. But sometimes what gets lost in the midst of that is the kind of the actual broader objective around making sure that employees are as effective and productive in their job roles as they could possibly be. It's hard to think of a job role or a career path that isn't going to involve dealing with numbers and words in some form or other, or involve people having to be better at those things than they are already. So to put a little bit more context, I think one of the slides Paula had at the beginning of this session talked about that sort of the 9 million adults in the UK still needing to develop their literacy and numeracy. Globally, we're looking at more like 750 million, according to UNESCO, 2/3 of whom, interestingly, women who cannot read or write a simple sentence. So, and actually that broader kind of business case is sometimes around that notion of numeracy and literacy being important to organisations' efficiency, as well as obviously to individuals' life chances. And what we tend to often have, and again that focus around get them a level 1 or get them a level 2 qualification sometimes loses that, and that's understandable, because given the environment we deal with around apprenticeship standards, all of the contracting rules, all of the assessment plans, all of the sort of things that auditors are going to be looking at, it's not surprising that providers immediately will home in on, well, what are the rules, what is the least I've got to get them through, and what exams have they got to take, and of course all that fits in with kind of, well, what rate of funding can I get for them? How am I going to fit this around the other off-the-job commitments, and the time that they're spent away from the shop floor doing the thing that the employer is paying them to do. It's also, I think, also worth thinking that actually one of the things that's also there is thinking about employee progression and the apprentice's ability to progress. How good are they at dealing with customers? How good are they at budgeting, not wasting materials, getting on with colleagues, rather than, so there are things that, although they've got to achieve a qualification, there are things that they may well be having to develop. And let's also think about the endpoint assessment as well. Will they have to, for example, give a presentation, submit a report, take part in an interview? Are they confident about whatever it is that the particular standard they're working towards is going to require them to do? And there are some literacy and also in some cases some number skills that are going to come out of that. So there's a broader business case around numeracy and literacy capabilities, and a wider social and economic benefit. And I guess that's what drives the sort of steer from government, that this is something that they're prepared to provide the funding for, rather than it being something that forms part of the employer's financial commitment, or the levy commitment. I guess some of those wider considerations are ultimately, because I think the question that's often asked is why Sitting Guilds take an interest in this. Really what it was about us seeing for ourselves that in some cases literacy and numeracy was or rather where learners were struggling with literacy and numeracy was actually impeding their ability to make progress in their vocational learning, or equally to make progress in their job roles and their career paths. I think we could also see, if we're honest, that the diet of maths and English that learners have been fed at school haven't necessarily always been as helpful or as of practical use to them as it might have been. So it ties in very much into our broader mission as an organisation about supporting individuals into a job, enabling them to make progress in that job and move on to the next job. So having put a little bit of context, let's now look at the actual programme and funding rules and obviously the things that ESFA are willing to help in terms of providing money for, but also the expectations and the rules. The clear one that kind of underpins that sort of standards as a whole is that minimum qualification attainment, and that notion that the apprentice must have, at least prior to achieving the gateway, at least a level qualification in English and in maths, if they're working towards a level 2 standard, or at least a level 2 qualification in English and maths if working towards a level 3 or above standard. There is that broader expectation that all apprentices, regardless of what qualifications they walk in the door with, are expected to show that they're developing their maths and English whilst on programme. So even if the ESFA auditors are going to be obviously concerned about what aim they've recorded, often when they rock up are certainly going to be wanting to see what progress the individual is making in terms of their maths and English development, and that may not necessarily be manifested through a qualification. It may well be showing that they're applying some of those skills to their job, but there is an expectation that the provider has a story to tell about how that works. And again, thinking about their EP, what they're going to need to do for their EPA, what they're going to need to do to be effective in that job role is an important part of that as well. Another key consideration, especially for where you have apprentices following a level 2 standard where their actual minimum qualification attainment level is only level 1, is this requirement to study and take the test for level 2. I think it was a rule that was probably always born of good intentions, and it's certainly what it does do is underline this point that apprentices should be setting their sights beyond the minimum. I think our feeling right since this came in is that it's not necessarily framed in a very particularly helpful way, because it's framed around the attempting the qualification at level 2, and the bit that sometimes gets lost there is that what it was trying to drive was supporting the learner to make progress beyond that minimum and work towards level 2. So that's one to obviously watch, and it is one that obviously auditors will be looking for in terms of making sure that learners are seen to be making progress and making meaningful progress towards level 2, not just being entered for the level 2 exam, box ticked, and that's done. They will want to see that their learners are actually being supported to, even if they don't ultimately achieve a level 2 qualification, to at least be on a journey where that is taking them beyond the absolute minimum. The thing that often also can be an issue there is where learners arrive on programme already having a level qualification. They won't be funded to work towards level 1, but obviously funding would be available to support them on that journey towards level 2, even if level 2 isn't mandatory for the standard that they're working toward, or achievement of level 2 rather is mandatory. Worth also pointing out that actually where learners have an education healthcare plan, there are some adjusted maths and English requirements for apprentices. But in many cases, that's about them being able to work toward or achieve a qualification at entry 3, the level below level 1. What that would obviously need to happen, what would be necessary in that situation is obviously that there's a need to make sure that that's evidenced and agreed as part of the contract. Worth also saying it's possible to bring forward prior achievement of other qualifications besides functional skills and GCSE. There's a definitive list that ESFA published, but basically what they've limited to that too is qualifications that are either regulated by Ofqual, so some of the obviously predecessor qualifications. So anyone who has a key skills qualification from 15, 20 years ago can potentially use that towards the qualification requirements. Anybody with a CSE that they achieved many years ago also can potentially use that. So it's got to be obviously within the regulated qualification arena within England, but they will also accept comparable qualifications from the regulated in Wales or Scotland as well. There is also a potential to use international qualifications as well, but they involves going through the NARIC system and showing that they are of a comparable standard to GCSE. So there is a mechanism for doing that as well. Another thing that I know does catch people out quite a bit as well is the often off-the-job rule, which doesn't include maths and English. So there is a need to obviously make sure that, and particularly this can be an issue for providers where they are doing what Ofsted and others would encourage them to do, which is integrate maths and English into their programme. The thing you have to be careful though in calculating that is that when you're calculating that minimum of 20% off the job, that you're not directly counting maths and English as part of that, and that you're factoring enough additional time away from the job to ensure that you're showing those things are coming through. The other thing obviously to be aware of is that any of those minimum qualification attainment requirements have got to be achieved prior to going forward to Gateway, and the endpoint assessment organisation, whether it's us, whoever it might be, will clearly need to see that and need to see evidence of those qualifications having been achieved. So again, a bit of context, a bit of rules. Move on more specifically to the recent functional skills reforms. These were the first big kind of overhaul of functional skills since the qualifications originally were introduced 10 years ago. So quite a big kind of shake-up to the system. Some of the changes, I think, if we're honest about it, were about positioning and particularly resetting the relationship between functional skills and GCSE. The original report that prompted these reforms that the government commissioned about 5 years ago, almost the first line of that report stated that functional skills wasn't broken. But so we ended up actually seeing some probably bigger changes to it than were initially envisaged at that point. But in order to put those into a nutshell, probably the best way of thinking about it is to think that the old functional skills, the legacy qualifications as they tend to now be described, were almost entirely about problem solving. They were relatively light. If you looked at the standards for them, they were relatively light on detailed subject content, or rather what they tended to do was take a lot of that for granted and assumed that it was already there. So the assessments were very much focused around unpicking quite complex scenarios and learners having to work out for themselves the maths or the English that they would need to do to get the job done, which was, I think, fine as a principle. But one of the things that it did create was a bit of a barrier in the sense that it meant that often, sometimes learners, even if they could do the maths or they could write what they were asked to write, were sometimes struggling to get to the nub of what it was they were being asked to do. So, and the thing that I think often heard when I've talked to providers was that notion that the maths assessments could often feel more like English because there was a lot to read and a lot to take in and a lot to understand. And that was by design. That was quite deliberate, and that was how the old qualifications worked. The reformed qualifications are a little bit more balanced. They have a bit more of a look and feel that's a little bit closer to GCSE in that there is much more testing of the skills themselves as well as the ability to apply them. The most visible signs of those changes are the new sort of non-calculator section that now appears within the maths exam, and the ban on dictionaries and spell checkers that's now there for the writing component of English. Worth saying that dictionaries are still allowed and still expected to be used within the reading component, just not for writing. There's a bit more of a mixed bag in terms of what learners are being asked to do. So those really wordy problems that might have been problematic in the past have tended to be replaced by more straightforward calculations. Although where there is a focus on problem solving, there's quite a lot of emphasis on fitness for purpose and audience. So where a writing exam is asking the learners to write a complaint letter, they need to be quite clear in that letter the outcome it's expecting, or if it's a report they're being asked to produce, there would be an expectation that it's coherent in the points it's making. There has been quite a lot of rhetoric doing the rounds over the last year or so about the reformed qualifications being harder. I think I would caution against getting too carried away with that. Some of that was, for honest, rhetorical. It was about trying to sort of beef up functional skills credibility alongside GCSE. And I think what is also worth saying is that a lot of the teaching and learning that has taken place in regard to the legacy qualifications will still be perfectly relevant, still perfectly appropriate. What is important though, and this is something we've certainly been urging providers to do, is ensure that they really do engage with the new subject content statements, the new subject, effectively the assessment criteria that underpin the reformed qualifications. These statements, they are the same regardless of which awarding organisation you're working with to do functional skills. And one of the things that's also characterised the reforms is a much tighter set of regulations, so a much closer alignment between awarding organisations in terms of the assessment expectations and how those are applied. Another big change that I think has particularly been of note to work-based providers has been that stepping up of the exam conduct requirements and expectations. Again, I think it's worth seeing that as partly about upping the status of functional skills when compared to other qualifications like GCSE, but it's also about ensuring there's a bit more consistency and a bit less risk of anyone getting an unfair advantage. And it was also, I think, as I said a second ago, a little bit of it was also about ensuring greater consistency of approach between organisations. So where there are stricter rules than there were before, those rules will apply across all awarding organisations. We've, in response to that, published a new exam conduct document specifically for functional skills. Again, it was about obviously trying to make sure that where there are expectations, that those are clear and available to all, and setting out precisely what is and isn't allowed. One of the things, though, particularly to be aware of is that one of the key considerations is making sure that anyone who's been directly involved in the teaching of functional skills isn't involved in invigilating learners sitting exams in that subject. So anyone directly involved in teaching functional English is not, unless there are very particular circumstances, and that would be something we would have a conversation with them about. They wouldn't be expected to be at all involved in any shape or form in the invigilation of those exams. Finally, I think worth mentioning ICT. There's always been a third set of functional skills qualifications alongside maths and English ICT. Historically, quite a few apprenticeship frameworks used to include them, but in practice, that's tended to fall away. ICT wasn't formally in scope when it came to the 2019 functional skills reform. So the old ICT functional skills qualifications, for the time being at least, are remaining as they are. We'll perhaps talk in a second, and certainly when we get to the Q&A session, talk a little bit about what's happening in that space, because there are some new things happening, and particularly a new suite of digital skills qualifications that are kind of being rolled out over the next year or two. But just obviously to talk finally about functional skills with ourselves. And I think the main operational difference between functional skills and GCSE is that focus on the assessments being available year round. It isn't, and certainly it wouldn't be the sort of qualification where the exams are available once or twice a year. Everybody sits them in a big hall on the same day. Most of the assessment at level 1, level 2 is externally set and externally marked, so set by us and marked by us, although we make the exams available to order at any time. We also offer a choice of paper or on-screen delivery. The paper option has a 14-day lead-in, so it's kind of order papers a couple of weeks ahead of when they are intended to be used, whereas the on-screen, it's actually possible to schedule those the same day that they're taken. Unlike a lot of our on-screen exams, these aren't multiple choice tests. They still involve maybe not quite as wordy a problems as before, but they still involve having to solve quite detailed problems, producing documents, or having to explain things. So they're not the sort of thing that could be marked by a machine. We therefore have quite a large team of human markers on permanent standby to turn around any completed exam scripts that appear. We endeavour to do that within 20 working days. Occasionally it can be a little bit more than that if there are particular circumstances, such as a brand new paper for which we've got no previous history or data to kind of inform the sort of decisions about where the pass marker is set. But in a normal run of things, we would expect to be able to issue results far more quickly than the flat formal 20 working day SLA. Certainly when we were working with the legacy qualifications last year, well over 80% of the results were turned around in less than 10 days. Unlike GCSE, candidates won't get their paper back because with on-demand availability, we're constantly reusing tests. But what they do get is feedback on their performance with an indication of their areas of weaknesses. Another big difference compared to GCSE is the amount of focus on speaking, listening and communicating. Within English, it's formally a third of the qualification. And again, that was partly about reflecting the importance of verbal communication in most aspects of real life and certainly within workplaces. Unlike reading and writing, the assessment of speaking and listening is marked locally by tutors or assessors, and we provide a set of record sheets for that. Just turning attention now also to the resources that we make available to support maths and English teaching. Two main products that we have. SmartScreen is essentially a huge bank of learning resources, video clips, quizzes, worksheets, you name it, to support tutors. Alongside that, huge repository of stuff, and it is quite a massive kind of bank of resources. We also now provide what we call a resource guide, which sets out precisely what's available to support each of the functional skills subject content statements. So if there's a statement around learners being able to use fractions within the maths subject content, what we will then do is signpost all of the resources within that bank that are of relevance and use, with also some suggestions about how they can be used. A lot of these resources are again going back to situations where learners don't necessarily have to, or apprentices don't necessarily have to achieve a qualification, but are needing to show that they're making progress in maths. A lot of those resources could be perfectly relevant and could help support with other aspects of their journey, such as kind of preparing for what they're going to be required to do to get through the gateway. So we have that SmartScreen solution. We also have another more rounded solution that's more focused around taking learners on a specific journey towards functional skills, and that's a platform called eFunctional Skills. It's a kind of end-to-end journey, so it takes learners through an initial assessment tool, and then on a kind of quite a linear journey through a deeper diagnostic, some e-learning to focus on their identified gaps, and then some support to get ready for their end assessment of their end functional skills exam assessment. Thing about it is it's particularly easy to track what they've done, so it's quite well suited to situations where there isn't necessarily much face-to-face conventional classroom time that can be devoted to maths and English learning. There's quite a lot that learners can do on their own phone or on their own tablets away from a classroom environment, but you as the tutor, as the assessor, have got the ability to look and see what they're engaging with and how they're getting on with that. Another thing that I guess we tend to talk a little bit about as a USP for City Guilds is the availability of our technical advisor team. There's myself and then a colleague, Catherine Cooper, who does a similar role to myself, to share insights and obviously to work directly with providers. What we tend to do particularly is support providers with onboarding if you're new to working with us. But also what we would often do is organise quite a regular pattern of networks where we'll bring together providers from across a region to share insights and ideas and good practice. We also host a webinar each month where we'll spend a few minutes talking through a topic of interest within the worlds of maths and English. For example, we did one last week that was looking actually about funding arrangements for maths and English in other settings. So that's kind of a bit of background from myself. We just move on to the questions.
No, it's just the questions bit. So let's just see if we can pick out questions.
Ready, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay, so first question here we have is, would employers also be questioned on funding caps?
Is that
This was going in about 11:09.
So that's in relation to audits, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely in relation to audits. I'm not quite sure what you mean by funding caps. If you are if as an employer you are delivering your own apprenticeships, then you can be audited. Anybody who's accessing public funding and delivering with it can be audited by the ESFA to make sure they're using that funding with probity and adhering to the funding rules that the government and the ESFA as the government body put in place. So when you say questioned, I'm not quite sure what you mean by questioned. What the auditors will do, as I flagged during the slides, is look at the funding bands that do you mean funding bands or funding caps? And the funding bands that are in place for that particular apprenticeship, and they will make sure that the apprenticeships that as an employer provider, obviously you're using your own levy. So what they will look to make sure is that you are getting value for money, i.e. how much of the percentage of your levy you're spending on that apprenticeship, and is it realistic? So although you won't have a negotiated price with a provider, as an employer, you'll still be using your levy. So they will look at it in terms of how much are you spending on delivery, how much are you spending on use of premises, how much are you spending on materials and resources. They'll look at all of that and make sure that they think that the amount that you are charging yourself, so to speak, for delivering that apprenticeship to your employees is reasonable and is good use of public funds. Because much as the government might have once upon a time said the levy belonged to employers, it's a tax, they're public funds. So in reality, although you get it back as an employer,
The Treasury is still interested
the
in where it's going.
very interested in what you're doing with it and making sure you're spending it and not just using it, using it up as fast as possible by charging yourself high amounts of money for delivering an apprenticeship that's really costing you a lot less. So I hope that answers the question. If not, please do fire in another one and I'll be a bit more specific, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by funding caps. I think you might mean funding bands. Hopefully that answers it.
Okay, the next one is who is responsible for completing the employer apprenticeship agreement?
The apprenticeship agreement is if you're an employer provider, it has to be between you and your apprentice, as does the commitment statement. If you are a provider working with an employer, then the commitment statement has to be signed by the employer, the provider and the apprentice, and the apprenticeship agreement has to be signed by the employer and the provider. The apprenticeship agreement is really your legal document which keeps both you and your provider safe. So if you're an employer provider, you don't have to worry so much about an apprenticeship agreement because basically you are doing all of the provision. But if you're working with a provider, your provider and you must have copies of that apprenticeship agreement and it must be signed. It should contain exactly what you've agreed between each other. If you had to go to court for any reason, it's that apprenticeship agreement, that legal agreement between you and your provider, that will be the document that would come under scrutiny to make sure that for whatever claim the provider or the employer might be making in court. So it's really to keep you safe, and the auditors will look at that to make sure that it flags exactly what's being delivered, negotiated price, what you've agreed between yourself and the provider. But as an employer delivering to your own apprentices, I'm not sure that you actually need an apprenticeship agreement. I will check that and come back to you because you're working with yourself rather than an outside provider.
Okay, here's another bit of a long one. So can I confirm the comment about withdrawing someone from a program if their absence is no longer than 4 weeks? We are not delivering at the moment, but have apprenticeships on programs delivered externally. We have been able to pause learning. For example, when an individual has had an operation and will be off sick for 6 weeks. They have been able to pick up the program back up when they returned.
Right. So yes, withdrawal. It very much depends what the situation is with your independent, with your individual apprentice. When it comes to withdrawal, if they are going to be on, if they're going to be away from their program for a set period of time, you have to actually withdraw them. Now, I'm just double checking. I'm pretty sure that it is 4 weeks, but sometimes the ESFA change these things. So yes, it does depend on how long they're going to be away and how long they're going to be in your case sick for, because obviously they're having a hospital. They've got a hospital operation to go through, or a time in hospital. So there is a lot of information about this on the funding rules, because it did cause some confusion in the early days of apprenticeships about when an apprentice should be withdrawn and what happens when they're withdrawn, and how long you can withdraw them for. If it's just things like holiday, or they're taking an extra long holiday, so it's under the change of circumstances section, and that there are. I think what I'll probably do is respond to this via the Q&A, because it's quite a long-winded one that quite a long-winded answer that I need to give you, because there are lots of different scenarios. So if we put a couple of the scenarios in our Q&A, which AFTI is going to send to me later, and then we're going to send out with the slides and the recording, hopefully that'll answer your question in a far more comprehensive way than me bumbling along about it here with various bits of information. What I want to do is be able to give you some clear examples, and I will double check your specific example with your learner being off for 6 weeks because they were in hospital, and come back to you with some advice about what you should and should not do, or what you should and shouldn't have done. And that will work much better than me just ranting on there. Hopefully that's okay.
Okay, so the next one is, are there any apprenticeship standards that require FSO, I'm assuming functional skills, ICT?
As far as I'm aware, there are none. I mean, the way that there certainly is no there's no blanket requirement to include them. In theory, a standard could opt to insert it as a mandatory qualification. I'm not aware of any that at the moment that have. It has more or less. I mean, there are a few frameworks still that are kind of expecting those, but obviously they're gonna disappear over the next few months anyway. So as far as I know, there's no actual requirement. Probably is worth saying though that there is a plan to replace functional skills ICT in I was going to say just over a year's time, from September 2021, with a new suite of qualifications called digital functional skills. And they, unlike the other sort of maths, English kind of the rest of the functional skills suite, they're going to be pitched only at entry 3 and level 1, so they will be obviously quite different in focus, very much focused around working in a digital world rather than the old functional skills that were very much geared towards kind of using office applications and in quite a limited way focused around those. There is also another qualification that's been another sort of category of qualifications that's also being developed for principally for adult learners, that's due to come in later this year, called Essential Digital Skills, and there'll be a variety of qualifications that's due in August. That's due to come in this summer, and that will be not necessarily kind of apprenticeships, but certainly within more general adult education funding. It's a qualification or a category of qualification that will sit on the legal entitlement, so it'll be a qualification that's adults outside of the apprenticeship provision.
I'm going to ask a question here, so sorry everybody, I'm going to ask Paul a question as our functional skills expert, because he is the encyclopedic knowledge of functional skills. I had heard that qualification that's coming in the summer, the adult digital skills, will be free to anybody that needs it. Is that right?
That's essentially, yes. So it's going to be, I mean, it's a bit like the general maths English legal entitlement that applies at the moment, where learners haven't got a level 2 in English and maths. Forget whether they're on an apprenticeship or not at the moment, but if they're generally an adult, they have an entitlement to full funding for any provision that will get them to that level 2. The digital, the essential digital skills will be in a similar vein to that. So if they haven't already got a level 1, it's difficult to define a level 1 qualification, but if they have a need to develop their digital skills up to level 1, they will be able to draw full funding to access them.
Just quickly, Afti, sorry, this may help the person whose previous question about breaks in learning. I'm just rereading the rules, which I haven't read for 3 months, so I've forgotten bits of them. So the apprentice may take a break in learning where they plan to return to the same apprenticeship programme. The decision to take a break in learning and the reason for the break and its expected duration must be agreed with the employer. So you've got to, so the provider has to agree it with an employer, but obviously if you are the employer provider, then you agree it with yourself and the apprentice. And that can include medical treatment or parental leave or leave for other personal reasons. What you must do is record the break in learning on the ILR and then replan the delivery of any of the remaining apprenticeship or training that's got to be delivered following the break. So you might need to extend the end date, for example, because they've taken a break in learning. You probably would need to extend the break date. You'd also need to recalculate the off the job and when that would take place and how. So yes, they can take a break in learning. It no longer specifies how what that limit is. It used to specify 6 weeks, but it no longer specifies that. So it doesn't actually say how long that break in learning can or should be. That's an interesting one. So, and I have had a provider come to me say, well, we want the person to take a break in learning for pregnancy. Is that okay? And I think that was okay. So it doesn't specify a time or a length, but you must make sure that you've got it planned, that it's agreed, and that you've adjusted your ILR to account for it and extended the date and planned in the rest of the learning so they can complete that apprenticeship when they come back from the break in learning. But I will put that in the Q&A as well, and any other information I find that's useful for that.
Okay. The next one is, if the ESFA audit find fault with the training provider or any errors in RPL, IA, etc., will any clawback then be returned to the employer?
Now yes, I've had that question before. Very good question. I have actually asked that recently and I haven't had an answer yet. I've got a horrible feeling that the clawback of funding, it's a no. Realistically, particularly if it's around negotiated price and that the employer should have got a negotiated price that was lower than the one negotiated and a reduced duration, you would think that the money would go back into the employer's account, but I don't have an answer for that yet. I have asked it. As soon as I get an answer, I will let you know, and I'll include that in the Q&A as well. Or I might just send out an all points bulletin saying yes, it goes back to the employer, or actually no, it just goes into the government's coffers.
Okay, the next one. When you are using the term withdrawal, are you referring to pause or stop?
Sorry, I'm referring to a break in learning. I used the wrong context there. So if it's withdrawal, it's actually you're withdrawing the apprentice because they might have been made redundant and you can't continue, or they've resigned, or they've been dismissed. But actually this is what I was talking about in respect of gaps is a break in learning. So you don't actually withdraw. What you do is you flag a break in learning and then you replan the rest of the program and then obviously adjust your ILR to accommodate that break and the different end date and the replan program.
Okay, there's another one. We are having problems with some providers not promptly forwarding on additional payments to us as an employer. Does this features in the audit?
No, that doesn't feature in the audit, but it is in the funding rules. It makes it very clear to providers that they have to pay you any outstanding payments that are for 16 to 18-year-olds or bursary or care. They have to pay you within a given time limit. I'll check that time limit again as part of the Q&A and I'll let you know what it is, but I thought it was 30 days. It might be 90, but I'm pretty sure they have to pay you within 30 days. That was the original information given out on the technical funding document that they published at the beginning of the reforms, and that won't have changed. So I'll dig out that document. It's buried somewhere in my archives and I'll find out exactly what it says, but I'm pretty sure they have to pay you within 30 days. And if they're not doing that, then you can raise that with the ESFA as an issue with that provider. You should probably raise it with your provider first and make sure that they're aware that they have to pay you for those extra payments within 30 days. But I will double check that. I'll put it in the Q&A and we'll fire that out to you. But yes, they do have a time limit for making the extra payments to you as the employer if you're due them. It does depend what the extra payment is. So for example, in some cases, depends when you can claim it. So for example, if you are, it used to be that you would claim extra payments at, I think it was 30 days and six months. For some of the payments, so I'll double check when the payments are made and therefore when you should be expecting to get them as well.
Okay, the full funding for English and Maths, does this apply to people who are employed and regardless of what prior attainment they have, i.e. L4, MGT, etc.?
If we're talking about the adult education budget full funding, it's anybody who hasn't got, strictly speaking, it's actually anyone who hasn't got a GCSE at level, at grade C or grade 4 or above is the eligibility for that. I mean, what will go with that is if they have a comparable qualification for elsewhere, there would be an expectation that it would be wouldn't necessarily be able to access the funding in that situation, but it is usually about learners who haven't got, in inverted commas, to use the old language, an old full level 2.
So that would be a GCSE or a functional skills level 2 or whatever it was. If they haven't got that, then yes, they can take them. But if they've already got that or equivalent qualifications, the AEB won't fund them, and it will get picked up at audit. And then you could find that you're getting your functional skills funding clawed back.
Okay, and the last one. My understanding is that a learner registered under the old regime must pass through exams by the end of March. If they haven't done so, do we simply re-register them under the new regime and ensure they pass before they get to Gateway?
Right. Okay. Yeah, this is really about the phasing out of the legacy functional skills qualifications. There are some dates that obviously quite rigid dates here. These were dates that Ofqual were quite rigid about in terms of requiring all awarding organisations to make sure of. The absolute critical date is the 31st of August, because that is the last date on which we will be able to issue certificates for the legacy functional skills qualifications. What we've had to do, though, in order to obviously make sure that we don't sort of run up against that deadline, is start the process of phasing out the external assessments in particular for the legacy qualifications with enough time to make sure that those are all processed and dealt with well before the end of August. So what we are going to be doing is switching off the external exams for the legacy functional skills at the end of May. So 31st of May will be the last date on which those will be available to take. We will be taking down the documentation for the internal assessments at the end of April. And that will obviously be on the understanding, certainly if you have learners doing entry level, that would be an expectation that they will have done their assessments by that time. But similarly, for speaking and listening at level 1, level 2, that they will have been done by the end of April. And again, that's about making sure that there's adequate time for the internal verification IQA process to kind of happen and results to be claimed and all that, kind of without anybody running up against that end of August deadline. When it comes to switching from old to new, it's a slightly different story depending on whether learners are doing maths or English. In the case of maths, it's obviously one assessment component, and therefore if you've achieved the old, you've achieved it. You achieve the new, you've achieved it. Either's acceptable for purposes of the meeting the requirements of the standard. Obviously, we'd need to record the particular aim that they've worked towards for ILR purposes, but in terms of acceptability, either old or new is equally accepted. The same is true of English in terms of the qualifications. The only thing to be aware of that you're not able to do is to bring forward components of the old and count those towards the new. So if a learner had done the reading component of the old, hadn't managed to get the writing done by the time we got to the point of withdrawing the exams, they wouldn't be able to carry the reading component forward into the new. So what we've generally been saying to providers is make sure you don't rely too much on that end date. If there's any prospect of learners not being kind of comfortably through before we get to that point of starting to withdraw the exams, you probably would be wise to look at moving them across to the reformed qualifications. You may well find that that's a better fit for some learners in many cases anyway, and certainly my experience in talking to quite a few providers is they've made a point of trying to move people across early rather than leaving it to the last minute. But you do also need to be aware of those withdrawal dates as well.
Okay, just one last question.
Sure.
So a question reference to apprentice eligibility. In the post-Brexit world, will learners who have been in the EU resident for the time before getting on programs still be eligible for apprenticeships?
Ooh, good question.
A lot of that depends on where their residency is, whether they've got a British passport. I mean, all the residency rules about EU citizens are in the funding rules currently. I will ask the ESFA if they intend to issue new updated funding rules. Now we are Brexiting tomorrow. Actually, we're not allowed to use the word Brexit anymore, are we? Because Boris has banned it, apparently. So what do we call it? Leaving the EU? I don't know. But yes, we are leaving the EU tomorrow. So I haven't heard anything from the ESFA about new rules around eligibility, because I think actually the rules around eligibility currently within the funding rules are pretty comprehensive, and it's not so much about where you live now. I mean, obviously, actually, if they live abroad, they can't do an apprenticeship in England anyway, because we can't deliver apprenticeships abroad in Europe. So they've got to live in the UK 50% of the time, or be based in the UK 50% of the time. That's part of the funding rules. So if you've got someone, for instance, flight attendants spend a lot of their time out of the country, but they've still got to take their apprenticeship to be a flight attendant, but they have to spend 50% of their time in the country whilst they're doing that job. So it's not a case of where you're resident. It's more about your passport and your citizenship and your right to remain. Or your right to stay. So I'm not going to make any further comment than that, apart from read the funding rules about eligibility. And what I will do as part of the Q&A is actually ask the ESFA if they're intending to make any adjustment to the eligibility criteria for EU citizens who are in the UK, or for those that are moving back, and see what they're going to say, if there's anything else there, or actually if the current funding rules cover it for you.
I mean, the current funding rules should stand at least until the end of the transition period at the end of the year.
Yes,
anyway,
they probably, well, yeah. You should hope so.
They should,
yes, they should.
Yeah. It's just obviously.
Yeah, whether they will or not is another question. So yeah, we'll find that out and we'll put it in the Q&A, everybody.
And that's it. That's all the questions.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that was helpful. Watch out for our other webinars, which will be coming up over the next couple of months, because we will be doing more of them, particularly as policy announcements are made, because we have got a lot of potential policy changes happening in the FE and skills landscape over the course of the next year. The level 4-5 reforms, the level 3 and below reforms, possible reform of the apprenticeship levy. So there's all sorts of things happening out there, and as soon as we hear anything, we'll be doing an analysis and providing a webinar to update you on what the next moves are and what we think will happen in the landscape. So keep an eye on LinkedIn, keep an eye on Twitter. My LinkedIn is @Bryony-Kingsland. Paul's
Mine, I think, is the same. Paul @Paulsini.
@Paulsini.
Twitter's Paulsini_CG.
And yes, and Twitter for me is again Bryony-Kingsland, BRYONY. So. Various other webinars of ours are up on our apprenticeship website of City and Guilds, and on the ILM site, and also under our adult education budget page in the funding pages of the City and Guilds website. So you can find more webinars there, including the one I did on Monday about use of AAB in apprenticeships. Thanks very much, everybody. We hope that was useful. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.